very grateful to be here, very grateful to be able to spend some time with you this evening talking about humility, just to kind of give you a sense of where we're going. I'm going to talk a little bit about what humility is. I'm going to also importantly talk about what humility is not. I'm going to share a little bit about why I think humility is important, and particularly why I think it's important right now. And then I'm just going to provide a little teaser of some things that we can begin to start thinking about when we're contemplating how to cultivate humility. And really that's what next week will be all about. And then I'm going to try my best to dispel some myths that I think that we have around humility, and why I think sometimes even conversations around humility might have a little bit of resistance. So just to provide a frame, if you're really interested in humility, if you'd like more of a deep dive into the scientific research behind humility, the practical application of humility, as was mentioned, I published a book a couple months ago in the summer of 2022, really summarizing the research on humility and kind of providing practical aspects and practical applications for how this can be developed. And so it's called Humble. It's available wherever books are sold. Go down to Reader's World, pick up a copy. But I think that I'd like to start with the definition. I had a wise mentor who said definitions are the fountainhead of knowledge. So I think it's important that we understand what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about humility. So in my mind and in psychological science, humility is all about being the right size in a given situation. So the metaphor I want us to be working with to begin with is about being the right size. So in that, humility researchers kind of think about humility as the golden mean. And so we kind of want to be perfectly situated between, on the one hand, what's called servility, and on the other hand, what's called arrogance. And so the way that we tend to think about humility, and whenever I tell people I study humility, they say things like, oh, that's just like not thinking about yourself, or that's just kind of being humiliated or being ashamed. And it's really not quite right. So most of us see the ditch on one side of humility when it comes to being too big, and that's arrogance, right? So if you're in a situation and you're the first one to accept praise, but you shirk the blame, or if you're somebody who overclaims knowing something when they really don't, or you're someone who speaks first and doesn't really appreciate or enjoy listening, most people would probably say that you're rather arrogant. And most of us would identify that that's not humility, right? That's being too big in a given situation. On the other hand, though, what's not humility is on the other side of the road, right? And so there's a ditch on the other side, and that's being too small in a given situation. And what researchers have termed this is what's called servility. And here, this is where you're not actually encompassing the space that you have earned. So for example, if I'm about to have a critical medical procedure and my surgeon comes in and I'm like, all right, all right, doctor, what's the plan? And my surgeon says, I don't know, Daryl, what do you think we should do? That's not at all what I want to hear from my surgeon, right? I don't want my surgeon kind of taking a poll of what I think right before a major critical medical event, right? I want that surgeon to come in and say, I've gone to school, I have the training, this is exactly what we're going to do. And I'm going to say, yep, we're going to do that. And I trust you, right? You're acting the right size in that situation. I don't want my surgeon being overly deferential to me because I don't know what I'm talking about, right? That would be being too small in a situation. Sometimes when I think people have struggled historically in the past with humility is that the concept of humility has oftentimes been misunderstood or outright misused by people who are in power. And a lot of people think that being humility is shrinking, being too small, and not taking up your space. And so what I'd like us to do is think differently about humility as being the right size, not too big, not too small, but appropriately sized in a particular situation. So we're going to avoid arrogance and servility, right? We're not going to go around assuming that we are the best. And even after, going through a couple of these, this week and next week, I hope none of us walk out of here saying, gosh, I'm sure glad that I went to that because now I'm the most humble, and, bragging to your friends about being the most humble. I can assure you It's very low-hanging fruit. Anytime anyone asks me, what it's like writing a book about humility, I can assure you I have not mastered this concept by any way, shape, or form. And if you talk to any of my friends or family, they know I'm not perfect in this domain. But on the other end, we're also going to avoid servility, right? We're not going to keep shame on ourselves. We're not going to be too small. We're going to be the right size. So let's just take a little bit of a closer look at humility. So if we really want to press into the two dimensions of humility, right? So what would it look like to be right-sized in a situation? The first dimension is something that happens within ourselves. Okay, so the intrapersonal dimension of humility involves having an accurate view of yourself. So if you're going to be the right size, you kind of have to start by knowing yourself, right? It starts with a self-awareness that comes from knowing your strengths and your weaknesses. So it's owning up to and acknowledging that you have some weaknesses, right? You have some areas for growth. But it's also acknowledging there are some things you're pretty good at. There are areas where you have strength and you can really lean into those strengths. A second area that's a little bit more difficult for folks to do is admitting the limitations of our beliefs. So all of us have beliefs about the way the world works, but the truth is that all of our beliefs contain some error, which means that none of us is exactly right? All of us are kind of wrong, at least about some, if not most things. And it's also admitting what you don't know and that you don't know everything. And this is a hard thing, right? As a college professor, I get paid to know things, but really, right? Like I get paid to profess. Students come, they want me to tell them what it is that I know. There's a lot I don't know. In fact, most things in the universe I don't know about. I know a very small portion of a very small field at a very small point in history. There's a lot that I don't know. Interpersonally, so relationally, what does humility look like? So if it's knowing yourself, right, kind of being self-aware. Interpersonally, it involves thinking about the needs of other people. And so one of the ways we see that coming out is by restraining our ego, right? So a lot of us have kind of this natural desire to be selfish and make sure our own needs are taken care of. We really want to be the first people to accept praise, but not the blame, rather than share the praise and accept our fair portion of the blame. It means interacting respectfully with other people, especially other people with whom we disagree. If there's one thing that we've gotten incredibly good at in our society, and we're so good at this, I'm not sure that we should be bragging about this, it's our inability to interact with people with whom we disagree. We're just really bad at being in relationship, honest relationship, thoughtful and respectful relationships with people with whom we disagree. And in fact, over the past, 5 to 7 years, between political tensions, between health pandemics, one thing we've realized is that we feel like it's okay to ostracize, kick out, and otherwise denigrate people who hold different beliefs than us. And we're fine cutting people out, whether they're family members or friends. And we don't feel like we have to respect people with whom we disagree. And that's not humility. It involves, this is going to be hard. Don't worry, it keeps getting harder before it gets better, but I promise it eventually gets better. But maybe I should say it gets better at the second, event, so that way you'll definitely come to the library next week. So the other part that gets a little bit tough is prioritizing relationships over proving you're right. So a lot of us really like being right. Feels good, right? I mean, who doesn't like being right? But we shouldn't go out of our way to prove that we're right to someone else, because doing that usually comes at the cost of a relationship. And so this doesn't mean that you don't hold any beliefs, and this doesn't mean that you can't be right. But what this means is that you care enough about the relationship that the most important thing isn't proving that you're right. So when researchers have studied this, humility, when they've studied the intrapersonal, so this self-awareness, and the interpersonal, this respectful interaction, what they found is there's actually 4 different types of humility. And we'll take a look at each of these, but I just wanted to give you the bird's eye view briefly. So one form of humility is what's called relational humility. And this is humility that involves other people. We see it in relationships. And it looks like caring about other people and checking our own ego. We can also have intellectual humility. And the focus here is around ideas. And we usually see this when people are open to new insights and they can seek learning. We also know that there's a cultural humility where we experience this in cultural interactions when people are debating the ways of life, the ways that they should live. And the way that we see this expressed is when we learn from others and we don't view our own culture as superior to other people's culture. And then finally, more recent research has found that there's might be this existential humility where we have this humility regarding ultimate questions and we feel relatively small in comparison to nature, the universe, or God, and we can express gratitude to something larger than ourselves. So let's take a look at each of these different forms of humility. So if we're thinking about relational humility, remember this is in relationships, what does this involve? Well, one thing it involves is being self-aware. So knowing your strengths and weaknesses, including the areas in which you could grow, right? So where are the areas where you could put more time developing yourself? Where are the areas where you realize you are not as strong and you need to rely on other people to complement your giftings? It involves being fair. And in here, what I mean is if someone congratulates you, if somebody gives you praise, if somebody pays you a compliment, are you willing to share the praise as is necessary, right? Were there other people who contributed to your work project? And if you're getting all of the credit, should you share some of that credit? And in the same way, are you willing to accept your fair portion of the blame? If you're like me and you're a human, most of us just like the praise and we don't like the blame. And so this can be a challenge for us. It means being respectful, so interacting in a way that shows other people how much you value them. So really conveying to other people you care about them, that they're a person of worth and value, and your interactions with them communicate that. And then finally, being empathic. So empathy is both an attunement to the emotional needs of someone else, as well as taking their perspective. And when you tune into someone else's emotion and you're able to take their perspective, what you're really doing is you're showing them your needs are as important as my needs. So a lot of times when people think about humility, one of the biggest fears about humility is they fear being exploited, right? They're afraid, well, if I care about other people, does that mean I have to put my own needs on the back burner? And true humility really involves an equal set of needs. So my needs and your needs are equally as important. And I'm empathic to yours while holding a boundary to mine. And so we can see relational humility through self-awareness, through fairness, through respect, and through empathy. Well, what might intellectual humility look like? Because this is another variation on our humility. So intellectual humility looks a bit like this. It looks like being intellectually open. So avoiding dogmatism and being willing to revise our beliefs. So most of us believe what we believe in part because we just think that we're right? And if we didn't think we were right, we'd obviously change our minds. But the problem is sometimes we're so committed to thinking that we're right and that other people are wrong, we're just kind of unwilling to change. We figure that we have it all figured out. And so what could we learn from other people? So intellectual humility looks a lot like starting with being intellectually open. It also looks like being curious. So are you somebody who seeks new ideas, right? Are you looking for new ways to expand and grow? And here's the key. When you're presented with evidence, are you willing to change your mind to align with that sufficiently strong evidence? Right. So a lot of people are like, oh, yeah, I'm very curious, love reading, love exposing myself to new ideas. But then at the end, they don't really do anything in response to those new ideas. So are you someone who is willing to revise what you believe when you come into contact with evidence that suggests that you should? It involves being realistic. And in here, what researchers mean is, are you willing to own and admit that you have flaws and limitations, right? All of us have cognitive biases. Most of us, sadly, see the world as we want it to be, as opposed to seeing the world as it truly is. And so being realistic means seeing the world as it is, right? Not through the ways which we want to see it, not just in ways that confirm what we're already looking for. And then, are you someone who is teachable? So in this, are you someone who can express your beliefs non-defensively? And are you willing to change your behavior to align with new knowledge? So are you someone who can actually respond and grow when you realize you have areas to grow? Okay, so we've looked at relational humility, we've looked at intellectual humility. Well, what might cultural humility look like? So cultural humility looks a little bit like being thoughtful. So most of us just assume the way that we interact with and view the world is just natural. Well, anyone should see the world and think about the world the way I do. I mean, come on, I think about it this way. That's just normal, or that's just right. And that's not really cultural humility. That's more of cultural arrogance. Cultural humility is more of not viewing your cultural way of life as superior, but realizing your way of seeing the world is just one of many ways of seeing the world. And in fact, there's a lot that we can learn from other people and their ways of seeing the world. And so that leads into being a learner. How much do you really desire to learn about the cultures of other people? How much do you care to learn about ways of doing things, ways of life that are different than your own? Are you willing to be open to that? Can you be respectful when viewing and treating other people as equals, even when there are differences and disagreements? So sometimes people are willing to kind of muddle through and tolerate that other people are different, or they talk about, those relatives who voted for that person, and they kind of scoff. And even though they're willing to be in the same room as them, they don't actually view them as equals. They don't view them as worthy of respect, worthy of the same dignity, and having the same human worth as people who align with our viewpoint or align with our cultural worldview. And so being truly respectful and valuing other people on the same level is part of cultural humility. And then finally, people who are culturally humble see diversity as a strength, right? So they realize that any idea is made stronger with diverse and divergent viewpoints. The more people we have solving a problem, the better, because they're going to provide new perspectives and new ways of thinking about things that we had never considered. And so they view the rich tapestry of diversity as something that strengthens communities rather than pulls it apart, makes it harder, or something that's undesirable. Then finally, we could consider, well, what would an existential humility look like? So existential humility looks a bit like being in awe. So one of the things that I loved doing when I was a little kid, I loved astronomy. I loved looking up at the stars. I loved learning about the planets. One of the things I think I loved realizing is that the world, the universe is vast. It's so big. And part of existential humility is being in awe of that vastness, right? There's so much beauty. There's so much to be grateful for in this world that type of existential humility situates us in awe. And if you've ever looked into a telescope or you've ever peered over the Grand Canyon or stared over the ocean or Lake Michigan, have you ever felt small, just really small? And in fact, that smallness is rather freeing. So sometimes existential humility looks like appreciating our appropriate smallness. That's sometimes the fact that we're kind of rather insignificant, not that we don't matter, or that people don't love us, or that we're not people of worth, but in the grand scope of the entire universe, we're kind of small. That's freeing, at least it is to me, because it makes my questions about what to have for dinner or if I mess something up seem relatively minor or inconsequential in comparison. Now, that doesn't mean that I can just get away with anything or my actions have no consequences, but sometimes it helps us kind of reframe and put things into perspective. It also means accepting our human finitude and frailty. So we spend a lot of time trying to deny the fact that we humans are limited. Okay? Being limited and having liabilities is a natural part of being human. None of us can do everything. All of us have limits. Every decision we make by saying yes to one thing is a no to something else. And all of us have to come to terms with our own finitude. One day we're going to die, right? We're not going to live forever. And that honestly, for most of us, that terrifies us. We spend most of our time avoiding the fact that one day we're going to die by doing all kinds of things to deny that evidence, right? We inject our face with all kinds of poisons to make it seem like we're not aging, because that would be horrible, right? Because why would we want to do that? Or we invest really hard to make sure that everyone's going to remember us. So we invest in symbolic immortality. We donate a lot of money so the hospital wing gets named after us, or we make sure we have these creative works that everyone will remember us by. I can take solace in knowing that, all the people on this call right now will forever remember my name and forever be talking about this presentation for years to come, and I will live on in generations. I'm not that delusional to think that's the way it works. Instead, I think we should embrace the fact that we have limits, that we humans have finitude, and come to terms with that and accept that. And when we do, right, when we can be in awe, when we appreciate our smallness and we can embrace our human frailty, I think the only natural response is gratitude. Being grateful for being alive at all, for being able to share even just a small part of life with other people, and being grateful that you are where you are, not because of your own individuality, but because of a community of people for whom planted trees long before they were able to rest in the shade of the seeds they planted, and you were resting in the shade of those seeds, right? You were raised by people who gave of their time, of their effort, of their resources to invest in you. And so the only natural, realistic, and thoughtful response would be gratitude. So I've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about humility as being the right size. We've talked about definitions of humility, and we've talked about different types of humility. Are there any questions? I'd welcome any questions from folks so far, any clarification that's needed. I'm happy to take that now. Otherwise, I'll press on and there'll be other check-ins in the future.
So just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, go ahead and drop your question in the chat box at any time. And then I'll just kind of ask Daryl all of the questions all at once. But Daryl, I have a question that kind of came to my mind as people, maybe if they're thinking about, what if, like, I'll be honest, like my first instinct, right, in hearing all these, definitions of humility is like, yes, I think everyone needs, like, this is what those people need, right? My first instinct is to like go, oh, that's what these people need. What do we do? How do we navigate that as we think about that? And maybe you're going to get to that a little bit more later on. But, if our first instinct is, yeah, those people need more humility.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Right. So a lot of people are like, oh, Daryl, I loved your book. I gave it to my father-in-law. Right. It's not like I loved your book. I read it because I needed it. It's more like there's people in my life who I want to be humble. And what I would say about that is, well, thanks for buying the book and giving it to your father-in-law. But the second thing is, humility itself is hard work. And I think there's a kernel of truth. If we want other people to be humble, we just haven't finished the other half of that equation. Because the other half of that equation goes, so why wouldn't they want us to be humble? Right? Because what we're saying is humility is really this desirable characteristic, and we want to be around people who are humble. And I'm going to go over some research that suggests overwhelmingly, yes, we want to be around people who are humble. The problem is a lot of us, myself included, so it's not just you and it's not just everyone who's listening, but most people want the benefits of humility without the hard work, right? And that's, I mean, it's a little bit of a cultural moment right now. I want to have run the marathon. I want the medal without having to put in the long, hard hours of training. And so to people who that would be their first instinct, I would say, acknowledge it and admit that is your first instinct. And then second, hang in there, because I think that some of the benefits of humility are definitely worth the work.
Thank you. Yeah, that one hit me right there, right? We want the benefits without the hard work. And so much of that's so true. So Linda asked the question, what do you think of the quote, humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less?
Yeah, Linda, that's a great question. And I've heard that one before. I would say I might agree with that to a point. And so where I would agree with that to a point is for those of us who probably think of ourselves too much, right? If we think about ourselves too much, we probably want to think about ourselves less And where I would not agree with that is we don't want to never think about ourselves, right? So one of the caveats I'm going to put in here, and I want to make sure I'm clear on, is good humility, thoughtful, wise, virtuous humility still has boundaries. And so to be humble doesn't mean that you're a doormat, that you have no opinion, or you just do what everyone else wants you to do. And you're just this worm who has no needs. Okay. That's how humility gets exploited. And quite frankly, that's why humility gets a bad rap, because everyone says, well, I don't want that. And usually the people that are told to be humble are told by people in power, so they just kind of stay out of the way and don't create, don't go against the flow. And so I would agree with that to a point, as long as we're thinking about ourselves appropriately, not too much, not too little. We can prioritize our other people's needs and our needs equally.
Yeah, thank you. Here's another question from Kent. Is it possible to have a good dose of humility in one area, such as existential humility, but not have cultural humility? Or do these areas of humility reinforce each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that question. My sense would be that generally we might think that they're related, but I do think they're independent. Yeah, I mean, I can imagine a situation in which somebody feels a lot of gratitude toward a higher power, maybe gratitude toward God, and maybe that the way that that's expressed is in a lot of ideological dogmatism and rigidity. And so what that means is, yeah, they're very grateful. They realize that they're small, but you better understand that their way of seeing God, the world, and their smallness is the only one right way to see that. And they're not really willing to entertain a conversation with you about changing that. And so I do think that that's why there are different expressions, right? In the same way, maybe relationally, I'm humble with my friends and family, but I'm a jerk at work, right? We can have different expressions. And so my goal is that we can work together to cultivate humility throughout all the aspects of our lives.
Thank you. I think we're ready to keep on going then, Daryl. Thank you.
All right, great. I'm loving these questions, by the way. These are great. So please keep them coming. All right, so I've kind of explained what humility is, but why is it important, right? Why, if I'm going to try to convince you, if I'm going to become a used humility salesman, why could I convince you to think about cultivating humility in your own life? The first is, and this is all based on over a decade of scientific research that's been done in this area. So the first thing is humility is really good for relationships. And so researchers call this the social bonds hypothesis. What this means is that humility really helps us cultivate and develop these strong social bonds. So one of the first studies my colleagues and I did is we created this mock dating profile study where we had students look over different dating profiles that were ostensibly written by someone who was really humble or someone who was kind of arrogant. And then they actually read over these and they indicated, how attracted they were to this person, how much they wanted to meet this person, share their phone number, things like that, go on a date with them. And overwhelmingly, people are more attracted to and want to be with romantic partners who are humble relative to being arrogant. And when I share this finding, people are like, well, what about the narcissistic life of the party? Isn't that who we want? And anyone who's been in a relationship with a narcissist is probably already typing out that response in the chat box right now, the no, you don't want to be in that relationship, because that's fun for like a couple hours, right? And then after that routine gets old pretty quick, especially because you become the target of the narcissist's antics and you realize that that's not kind of a healthy relationship. We've also found that people are much more likely to forgive humble partners. I'm sure you could imagine situations in your own life. If someone's more willing to take responsibility and own up to what they did and acknowledge that they have limitations, we're going to be much more likely to forgive them than we are someone who denies any wrongdoing, refuses to admit any mistakes, and says that they're virtually perfect. People are much more satisfied with humble partners. So we've done research studies asking about relationship satisfaction, and overwhelmingly people are much more satisfied. And they're also more committed to humble partners. So in many ways, humility is a signal to other people of how you're likely to be treated in a relationship. So if you see someone and you see that they're humble, you think to yourself, well, goodness, they're respectful, They put others' needs kind of equal to their own. They're willing to listen and empathize. I want to be in a relationship with them. And whether that's a romantic one, we also have done studies in terms of just forming friendships or work relationships or working on a task together. People are much more likely to want to work together with the person who's humble relative to the person who's arrogant. The second reason why humility is important is it smooths conflict and power struggles. And this is what we would call the social oil hypothesis. So you can imagine there are some relationships or even some organizations, because we see this a lot in business and workplaces. An engine is running at full speed. It can get really hot, right? The gears are all moving together. You need some type of oil to keep everything going together smoothly. Now, what research has found is in areas where there's potential for conflict or there's a power differential, humility is really important. And so a lot of work has been done that people prefer humble leaders relative to arrogant ones. Humble leaders are more likely to elicit creative responses from their teams. Their teams are much more productive, healthier, happier, and feel much more empowered. The thing that research has revealed is that when leaders are humble, they can also be hard driving. So it's not that, so I'm not making the claim that you just have to be kind of the hands-off, no motivation, cool boss, right? Rather, you can have really high standards, but the only way you can uphold those high standards is if you're simultaneously humble. Because if you have the high standards and you're an arrogant jerk or you're a narcissist who won't listen, you're going to lose your team. But if you're humble and you're willing to meet your team where they're at, you're able to have those high standards. Humility also improves therapy sessions. So when you're working with a therapist, a mental health therapist, what we find is that therapists who are humble have much better success, and their clients report much better outcomes and much better therapeutic alliance with clinicians who are humble. And we see that humility reduces intergroup conflict and aggression. And so some of the research that we've done has found that looking across religious and political divides, people are much more kind and much less aggressive to people who differ from them. So in one particular study, we had people write about a really cherished topic that they cared about. And then we gave them feedback, and we said that it was from another person, and this other person told them that their cherished view was all wrong. And then they were criticized on how poor their view was. And then in a later part of the experiments, we said, okay, well, that essay writing part is over. The next part of this experiment is for some other study, and it's a taste test. And you two are still going to keep on working together. And we gave them the opportunity to dole out hot sauce to this partner who had given them negative feedback after receiving information that this partner really didn't like spicy food. And what we found was that the humble people and individuals who were reminded of their humility gave far less hot sauce and were far less aggressive than people who were threatened and weren't reminded of their own humility. So it can reduce aggression. So one way of thinking about that altogether is that humility reduces relational wear and tear. Places where conflict is high, there might be power struggles, humility can smooth things over. And then we see that humility also improves our well-being. So this is more of an emerging line of research. What we find is that, for example, humility is related to a greater ability to engage with diverse perspectives. It's related to greater openness to evidence and the reality of the world rather than defensiveness, right? So if we're thinking about mental health and a number of mental health concerns being driven from an inability to accept reality, humility kind of opens us up to that objective reality as it is. It improves our well-being because we're more willing to learn, right? Because we're able to learn from our mistakes, and perhaps we can correct some of the negative patterns that we've gotten into, whether those are thinking patterns or behavior or relational patterns. Humility can reduce some of the negative effects of stress. And we've also found that it corresponds with better cardiovascular responses to relational conflict. So what do we mean by this? Another cool study that we did is we brought couples into the lab and we had them write down areas of disagreement. So we said, what are persistent areas you always disagree on? And don't worry, we got this approved by our ethics board. And so they told us the areas they disagreed on, and then we said, okay, great. We'd like you to discuss this area of disagreement right now in the lab for the next 10 minutes. And we had them hooked up to blood pressure cuffs. So we were getting a measure of their cardiovascular responses to this really stressful event of discussing an area of potential and persistent conflict with your romantic partner. What we see is that when both partners are humble, they have much better cardiovascular responses. Now, if one partner was arrogant and one was humble, or both were arrogant, the effects kind of go away. But if you and your partner are humble, that's going to make for a much better and much more productive disagreement or set of discussions around areas of conflict or disagreement. So humility is actually really good, doesn't reduce good. I'm owning up that mistake. That's my typo in the slide. It is good for the mind and the body. It reduces stress and is good for the mind and the body. So if we bring all these things together, in my mind, the key to humility is really a sense of psychological security. Okay, so the key to humility is a sense of psychological security. So what do I mean by this? A lot of times we get defensive when we feel like we're under attack. So whether our ideas are under attack, whether our sense of worth is under attack. And so what happens is we really strive to protect our overinflated egos, right? We've built up our egos in such a way that we've put our contingencies of self-worth on things outside of ourselves. Well, what do I mean by that? A lot of us go along thinking something like this. I'm a person of worth because I have enough money, or because of my professional success, or because of some standard of beauty or achievement. And so what happens is all of these external standards, am I beautiful enough? Am I rich enough? Am I famous enough? Am I successful enough? Am I esteemed enough in my profession? We put all of our self-worth on those external pillars. So then what happens is we're prone to fragility and defensiveness anytime we get feedback that we're not meeting one of those goals. Now, here's the problem. If you're always chasing wealth, beauty, fame, and status, there's always going to be people that are richer, more beautiful, more famous, or more successful than you are. Sadly, that's just the way it goes, right? And so what that means is we're always going to be feeling like we're never enough. We're always going to be feeling like we have to keep working to gain the approval of other people. And that is the trap of a narcissistic world. And so what humility does is it frees us from that trap. Humility reminds us, you are already enough. You are already worthy. You are already loved just the way you are. You don't have to do anything else to earn that love, that worth, that security, or that approval. You have it, because knowing that provides you with a sense of security, that when someone disagrees with your viewpoint, you realize they are just disagreeing with your viewpoint, right? If they don't like your view, that's just your view. It's not you. You are not your viewpoint. You are not your ideology. You are not your beliefs. You are separate from that. So you can create the appropriate psychological distance that you don't have to get defensive, because you realize you are already worthy. And so the goal in allowing humility to free yourself from the traps of a narcissistic world, and really the key for us to navigate difficult conversations, is for us to develop a non-contingent self-worth. That you realize you're already a person of worth and value and love and respect ipso facto. So just by definition, you're already worthy. And so then you don't feel anxious when you're scrolling through Instagram and you see other people are taking more exotic vacations, or driving fancier cars, or have clever sayings, or have 20 times the followers. I mean, I've got like 8 followers on Instagram. It's like my wife, my mom, and like an old college roommate, right? Anyone's going to beat me in that domain, right? And we all can find comparisons where we're going to fall short. And when that happens, we start striving, we start building our self-worth on unreliable areas that we feel really compelled to defend.
Daryl, just to pop in
Yes.
here, because there was a question I think that's kind of relevant even to what you just shared, which is this idea that Bob asked a question like, your examples of humility in therapeutic setting kind of uses that humble versus arrogant model, or even how you've kind of been framing a little bit like freeing ourselves from the narcissistic world. How should we see this psychological security through the lens of humble versus servitude?
Yeah, like maybe even in the therapeutic setting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so my sense would be, and I'm not a therapist, and so I wanted to say I'm a social psychologist, so I'm on the data side of things. My sense would be that in therapy, where we can see it expressed is when therapists take a genuine interest in getting to know their clients as an individual, getting to want to know their clients' cultural perspective, right? So kind of understanding their own lived experience and their own background. But also realizing at the end of the day that as a therapist, they are trained and they have gone through considerable education. They have gone through licensing and boards. They are certified. So they have a right size into which they can offer their clients some objective, useful, and wise feedback that they might not be able to get through people who haven't had that training, right? Through people who haven't gone through those rigorous standards of accreditation and boards. Better than maybe their friends could offer them because they have that objective space and have gone through that training. And so it's really being right sized. And so I appreciate that perspective. It's also not just being so deferential that the therapist doesn't feel like they have anything to offer to the clients, because certainly, licensed therapists do.
Yeah.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah. Well, and I think I'm wondering too, a little bit as you explore that, because I'm hearing a little bit in Bob's question, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but in culturally, women, we've also been enculturated to be in that servitude space, right? To think very little of ourselves, to see
That's right.
our worth through the lens of how much we can really find our meaning and purpose in other people and serving other people.
Yeah.
How does this psychological security kind of frame that piece for maybe that culturalized version of servitude?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, so it just flips it on its head, right? So what it does is it dispels and busts that antiquated view of humility as a myth. And I absolutely agree with you. I think that women, I think people who have been historically marginalized, they've been told humility means taking care of other people, and by other people I mean me, so I can stay in power. And that is a gross misuse of humility. So in this way, humility is empowering. And in fact, there are some philosophers who consider humility to be a liberatory virtue, because once you realize that you're already enough, oh, watch out. You are already enough. You don't have to earn the approval of other people because you're already enough. You're already worthy and you're already loved. And so your worth and value, everyone's worth and value, does not come from what good or service you can provide a capitalistic society, or what number of people you can care for so other people can stay in power, right? What it comes down to is you are a person of worth because you are a person of worth. And so it's liberatory, and it frees people from a previously oppressive form of humility that's not actual humility.
Thank you. Yeah. We had one other question, and I don't know if this is the time to ask it right now, Daryl, or not, but the question was, how does being an introvert or an extrovert make learning humility different?
Yeah, I would say that there are probably, so just for those who are kind of need just a refresher on being an introvert or an extrovert. So extroverts tend to get refreshed when they're around other people. Introverts tend to be refreshed when they are kind of spend some time in solitude or by themselves. And so it's possible that, there might just kind of be different pathways. So it might be that for extroverts, some of this humility work might be kind of sanding off some of those rough edges around others. Maybe for introverts, it's starting with some of that self-awareness. But I think for both introverts and extroverts, humility really is inherently relational. And so it's something we have to put in practice with others.
Thank you. And Kent noticed that there are something like 32 women and 5 men on this call. And he asked the question, what does that say? That women need to work on humility and men don't? Which I know is a little tongue in cheek from you, Kent. But also, right, the wondering, right, of like, maybe why is this conversation not as attractive to men to be interested in?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's got to be tongue in cheek, because if the data were to suggest anything, it's that men are going to need this more than anybody. We can all benefit from it. So, one of the I had a very, very bright student that I want to give credit to, Carolyn Preby, who did a senior honors thesis with me when she studied gender differences in the expression of humility, and what she found. And this was a brilliant study that she did. She found that women pay a steeper price for arrogance, and it's just another instantiation of sexism. That when men and women act the same way, women are judged by men to be more arrogant for acting in the exact same way that a man in the same situation was acting. And so what we see is that I think the social burden of humility has been pushed onto women to be more humble. And I think there's this social cultural narrative that men don't need to be humble, right? They're these rugged individualists. And in fact, we like narcissistic men, right? We want the dating profile with the shirtless man who's staring off into the distance, who doesn't need another person. And that's just patently not true. That's just not the way humans operate. But culturally, those are the expectations. And so, I mean, I think what Kent has kind of cheekily identified is at least there might be some potential perceived barriers among some men. It's like, oh, no, that's not something for me. That's something for someone else. And that in and of itself is a colossal barrier to humility. Because if you walk right by the book and you're like, oh, humility, yeah, I'm so good at that. You keep walking. Again, I'm not saying you have to buy my book, but that's the first step, is realizing maybe we all could learn something about being more humble. But unfortunately, the expectation has been such that it's unfairly fallen more toward women.
Thank you. Thanks for pausing right there for the question. So I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Yeah. So do we really need humility today, right? Like, isn't this some antiquated thing that philosophers talked about a long time ago? Or if you're a religious person, maybe some religious leader has mentioned at some point. I actually think we need it now more than ever. Right now, researchers, psychologists, sociologists suggest that the United States is undergoing a narcissism epidemic. So we have levels of narcissism that are increasing over each generation exponentially. And we're more enamored with ourselves and more addicted to self-esteem than we've ever been before. And it's become increasingly difficult for us to interact with people with whom we disagree. And this is for a number of reasons, right? This is in part because of the filtered news we get through the algorithms on our phone and our computer. This is because it's so easy to block someone that you don't like. I mean, imagine that. I mean, some of us I grew up in the 80s. I couldn't block my friend at school, right? What does that even mean? I have to hang out with my friend. This leads to tense family meals. This leads to stressed holidays. And so when we surround ourselves with people who think and look and act like us, we actually start thinking that the world is the way that only we think the world is. And so we start seeing the world as we want it to be. And so we've become so entrenched in our bias and selfish ways of engaging the world that we convince ourselves, well, we're not as bad as other people. They're the problem. If only the other people would be more humble, this would all figure it out, right? If people on the left would be more humble, or people on the right would be more humble, or religious or non-religious, whatever it is, whatever your in-group is, we blame the out-group. But the problem is, research has also found that we're more lonely, anxious, depressed, and miserable than we've ever been before too. So maybe our preoccupation with self-esteem isn't actually working, right? Maybe drawing our social circles increasingly more narrow isn't actually helping us be healthier. And so I think we need humility now more than we've ever needed it. And I think that we especially need it to navigate some of these difficult conversations. So I see humility as a radical countercultural solution to this problem. I find it to be a liberatory response. I think that it stands in direct opposition to these strong cultural currents that a lot of us are feeling. And I think it's something that we all desperately need to cultivate. And so the question becomes, well, how do we cultivate it? And so because we just did the check-in, I think I'm just gonna kind of go on to what are some ways we can start cultivating humility. So one is the first thing we can do is we can open our eyes. So by that, we need to seek feedback. So a really good place to start is to seek feedback from a trusted source. Now I highlight trusted because you want to make sure this is someone who's going to tell you the truth, right? They're going to be honest with you, and you're going to be able to accept the feedback that they give to you. So the very first time I ever did an interview on humility, my wife and I were supposed to go to the beach. I had promised her on a Friday during the summer, we're going to go to the beach. We're going to get there early. We're going to pack a lunch. We're going to stay the whole day. And so what do? I schedule an interview right for the time when we're supposed to leave, right? What kind of person does that? So anyway, an inconsiderate person who studies humility is someone who does that. So I booked this interview. My wife is very understanding about it. She says, yep, no problem. I'll pack the lunch. I'll get the things ready. You go ahead and take this interview. Well, what should have been a 15-minute interview turned into being well over an hour. And so this interview is just going on. And of course, I'm doing an interview on humility. Someone wants to hear about my research. I'm getting caught up in the moment. I'm not thinking about my wife, who I promised we're going to go to the beach together. And so the interviewer asks me, hey, it'd be really great. You study humility. I want to know, are you more humble as a result of studying humility? And I'm like, well, I'm thinking to myself, I really hope that's the case. And so she's like, who could you ask? I was like, well, I'll ask my wife if I'm humble. And she's like, great, have your wife rate you on a scale of 1 to 10 on how humble you are, and report back, because I want to hear this. I'm like, okay. So here I am. I've delayed our beach trip. I've made my wife wait an hour, and she's kindly packed the lunches. She's got the beach stuff ready. On my way up the stairs, I have another moment of colossal arrogance in which I was also at this time training for a marathon, and I needed to get a 7-mile run in. Well, we happen to live 7 miles from the beach. So as I'm coming up the stairs, I say, hey, Sarah, hey, thanks for waiting. By the way, could you take everything out to the beach, and I'll run to the beach and I'll meet you out there. So you right, like you'd have to schlep all this stuff out to the water and get everything set up, and I'll just meet you out there. So some of you are shaking your head like, oh my gosh, your wife is a saint, which is true. And then I said, oh, by the way, how humble am I on a scale of 1 to 10? So she gave me a 4. And I was like, oh, really? And she's like, wait, is 10 high or low? I was like, oh, 10 is high. And I thought, oh, well, maybe it'll flip. She's like, oh yeah, no, it's a 4. Yeah, you're a 4. In retrospect, 4 was probably pretty generous. I think at the moment I was like a 2 or a 1. And so that was hard for me to hear. And I got super defensive because that's what an expert in humility does, right? But I actually needed to hear that. What I needed to realize was, hey, you prioritized yourself, you weren't considerate, you weren't very grateful, and then you asked for another kind of inconsiderate, selfish thing. That's not humility, right? That's not being equitable, that's not being respectful. And so although it was hard for me to hear it, I needed to hear that. And so when you get that feedback, don't do what I do, which was got defensive. Instead, adopt a mindset of growth. And so realize none of us are perfect, right? None of us are perfect, but instead we can grow. We can use this information to improve, to take that feedback. And when we get that, also be aware of your biases. So we have these natural biases to be selfish, to protect ourselves, to kind of deflect. Realizing that your first natural reaction is going to be defensive is going to help you. So first thing you can do is seek that feedback. The second is, like I mentioned, open your mind, reduce your defensiveness. So when you get feedback, even if it's feedback you don't want to hear, realize that your first response is going to be to get defensive. Whenever someone challenges something you believe, realize that one of the reasons why you believe what you believe is it helps make life a little bit more meaningful, right? It explains why the world is the way it is. It provides you a sense of significance. And so when someone challenges your beliefs, what they're really doing, and they're not meaning to do this, but it's what's happening, is they're kind of undercutting your sense of meaning in life. And that can kind of feel really unsettling. And so you might need to regularly reaffirm other sources of meaning as you're kind of questioning your own beliefs, and start getting comfortable with the idea that you're wrong, right? Like I mentioned, most of us are wrong about some things. If you're anything like me, I'm wrong about most things, at least in some degree. So we're going to open our eyes by seeking feedback. We're going to open our mind by reducing defensiveness. And then we're going to open our heart, and we're going to start building empathy. And empathy really might be the cornerstone of humility, right? If you're starting to build the building of humility, we might want to start with empathy. So here, we're trying to take someone else's perspective. How would I feel if I had waited for someone I care about and really wanted to go hang out on the beach for over an hour, waiting, and then they tell me that it's going to be another hour and I've got to schlep all this stuff on my own. So take another person's perspective. Reflect on your shortcomings. Now, I'm not saying you have to dwell in the sense or in a shame spiral about how you're horrible, but just acknowledge you do have some shortcomings, right? You're not perfect. Like other people, you have some shortcomings. And then think about the needs of others, right? Consider what might someone else need in this situation, not just what you would need, but what might someone else also need, so you can kind of equally meet those needs. And another way that we can kind of get out of our own mind and build empathy is to get a wider view, right? Get some of that perspective we talked about. So for me, this is spending some time in nature. Go take a walk, right? This is going to get you out of your own mindset. It's going to widen your perspective to something broader. When I'm walking around trees, I'm looking around and I think these trees have been here long before I was here, and they're going to be here long after I'm gone. And there's something reassuring about that. And then finally, practice. So I saw a question came up in the chat. Is cultivating humility a long-term endeavor? Absolutely. I do not have a life hack for cultivating humility. I can't give you one simple rule to do, before 6 a.m. and you're going to have a humble life. I like to think about humility more as a little bit of like a marathon, right? If you're training for a marathon, it takes a long time to build up to that level of endurance and that level of fitness. In the same way, building up to humility, especially if we're naturally just more selfish, like all of us are, especially in this culture, right? Our culture has a moving sidewalk that always moves towards narcissistic arrogance. And unless we're constantly walking against it, we're gonna fall short of cultivating humility. So overcoming selfishness, it's hard, it's tiring, and we need practice. You can think about humility as this moral muscle that we need to develop, right? If we haven't ever done it, it's going to be a little smaller. And if we don't use it, it gets atrophied. So think about practicing humility in different settings and with different people and in different times. Can you practice it at home? Can you practice it at work? Can you practice it with your neighbors, with your friends? And slowly we can start making humility a habit. So one thing I'd like to do is I'd like to dispel a few myths about humility. So one myth about humility is that humility is merely lacking conviction. So in order to be humble, you just don't believe anything, okay? Research has found, and it's some of the research I've conducted, that we can hold our beliefs with conviction and humility. Okay? It doesn't mean we don't believe anything or we have no conviction about what we believe. Many of you might know Dave Myers. Dave Myers is a colleague in the psychology department at Hope College. He is a pillar of the Holland community, and one of the people I consider to be not only incredibly wise, but a paragon of humility. I really think Dave Myers is one of the most humble people I've met, and he has two axioms. He, as a reformed individual, he says he believes two things. I believe there is a God, and it's not you, and it's not me. That's it. Everything else, Dave is up for revising. So there's a God, it's not you and it's not me, right? And what I love about that is he's convinced about that. he knows that there's a God, and he knows it's not either of us or any of us on the call, but he is willing to change, but he's not willing to change those things. So one way I like to think about it is it's not the belief in nothing. It may be believing something until we have enough evidence to believe something else. Okay, so it's not the lack of a belief, but it's believing something until we have sufficient enough evidence to believe something else. A second myth is that humility is merely being wishy-washy. Okay, so this kind of goes along with the first one. Intellectual humility in particular doesn't require us to constantly change our beliefs. So we constantly don't have to say, oh, there's a new thing I never thought of. That's now what I believe. Or, oh, that's a new flashy idea. That's what I want to believe. Instead, you only do so in light of sufficiently strong evidence. Okay, so you have to have evidence in order to change your beliefs. We can and should have a high bar for changing our beliefs. And I think that that should be based on empirical evidence, right? On good evidence that you believe warrants that change. And sometimes when we interrogate our views, it doesn't result in us changing our beliefs. Maybe you've thought through your beliefs. Maybe you've spent years thinking about what you believe. Be willing to interrogate it, but at the end, it's also possible you may not change those beliefs. Humility is essentially servility. That's another myth, right? We've talked about that. It does not mean we simply align our views or our behaviors or actions with other people just to please them or maintain relational harmony. So this is not about having poor boundaries. It does not require shrinking or ignoring your earned expertise, right? I don't want my surgeon asking, what we should do. Doing so would be akin to being too small in a given situation, right? And humility is about being the right size. It's also a myth that humility has no costs, that it's going to fix everything and it's going to solve all of our problems. It's not a cure-all, and it may not always be appropriate. And I think that it really requires some wisdom to know which virtue to deploy in particular contexts, right? Maybe in certain contexts, what's more important is justice rather than humility. And we need to weigh which to express. And there might be some intrapersonal costs associated with intellectual humility, such as anxiety or personal uncertainty. So if you say, I don't know everything, and in fact, I might be wrong, sometimes that comes with uncertainty, that comes with anxiety, because we like to think that we're right because it provides us with a sure certainty and security of being right. And relationally, we might risk exploitation. So if we're humble and our partner's arrogant, we might worry about being treated like a doormat or being consistently taken advantage of. All right. I have one more check-in before the last kind of 15 minutes. So if there's any questions so far about kind of how to cultivate it or some of the myths, I'd love to hear.
Yeah. So Daryl, I think really actually this question really fits with that last slide pretty well, which is, under those definitions and even that cost of the interpersonal, can a person be considered humble while also having a no contact relationship with family members or others? Or are such boundaries seen as preventing the person from achieving humility or being perceived as humble?
Wow, there's a lot in there. We could probably spend like an hour just unpacking that. Yeah, I mean, I would never tell somebody that they needed to be in a relationship, especially like a physical relationship or close proximity relationship with someone with whom they felt unsafe, right? That's my initial research program before humility was on forgiveness, and we parsed apart forgiveness and reconciliation. Forgiveness was something that happened within you. Reconciliation was something that happened relationally, and those two things are separate. In the same way, I think, it's possible that you could be humble, and at the end of everything, you might realize that the safe, objective assessment of the reality is that it's not in your best interest to be in a relationship with someone. And so the firm boundary you're going to need to hold is kind of staying away and creating some distance. I think as long as someone has honestly, tried, they've engaged respectfully, and they're trying to be self-aware about what they're contributing and what they're bringing to that, I think that that's fine. I think if that's our first response, like, oh, someone disagrees with me, I'm done with them, that's probably not humility. But I absolutely think that someone could assess that, after kind of working through all these different steps, that it's just not safe for them to be in contact, I think that's totally reasonable. And it's possible that other people might perceive them as arrogant, and I'm not sure there's much we can do to change that perception.
Mm-hmm. I think what's fascinating about, having read your book and sort of thinking about this with you in this space is, that humility holds this certain paradox, or I don't even know if paradox is the right word for it, but, the opposite of selfishness is not selflessness when we consider it in the framework of humility, right? That there is this idea of enoughness that holds this space. And I think that kind of goes into this question that Linda asked, which is like, in the context of difficult conversations, might it be that a humble person is almost guaranteed to get railroaded? Can you kind of maybe parse that apart a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would probably pretty confidently say no, that they're not guaranteed. And I think there's a couple of reasons why they would not be guaranteed. First is they could be talking with someone else who's also humble. And when two humble people get together, it's actually an incredibly productive conversation. And that's actually where we see so much of the benefits of humility come to fruition. I would say the second reason why it's not guaranteed that they'd get railroaded is like you mentioned, and like we've been talking about, humility requires we need to still have good boundaries, right? So I have conviction, I'm allowed to have conviction. And one of my convictions is I'm enough. And another one of my convictions is I really don't deserve to be treated poorly. And so if someone treats me poorly, I can respectfully tell them that's not how this interaction is going to go. Otherwise, we're going to postpone this interaction until we can find a time where you can treat me more respectfully. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the opposite of selfishness is not selflessness. I think it's enoughness. And I think working from that place of enoughness reminds us that we're empowered to have those boundaries.
Yeah, thank you. Another question that was sent in is, how does one approach others who are very entrenched in their dogma and think the way they want the world to be is the only right way? It feels like you're on a fool's errand to try to dialogue with them.
Yes. Right. So how do we try to change someone's mind who's stubbornly and dogmatically convinced that they're right? I think my initial two thoughts about that are, and this might, you're all going to be upset and, log off now. All of us have that a little bit to some small degree in our own minds. So that's something all of us have to battle, is the thought that all of us know that we're right and are unwilling to change. And there are varying degrees, but we're all kind of pretty committed to and in love with our own ideas and ideology. Now, there are some people for whom they own it. And they're just like, I'm not going to change. You're never going to change my mind. And quite frankly, you're wrong. And unless you believe this one really narrow thing, horrible things are going to befall you and your family. That might not be a particularly productive conversation if your goal is to change their minds. But where I would go is, I'm not sure that our goal in conversation should always be to change the other person's minds. I wonder if a more humble approach in conversation, especially with people with whom we disagree, is to learn. Because an amazing thing happens once you learn. You start seeing the other person as human. And another amazing thing happens is when you actually listen and learn, they start to soften. And they actually start seeing you as a little bit more human for wanting to listen and wanting to learn. Because the way most of these conversations go is we hold our breath just long enough for the other person to stop talking, that we can try to convince them that they're wrong and that we're right. And that doesn't actually result in any listening or any learning. And so if we approach it that the goal is to learn, or if the goal is to foster a relationship but not change people's minds, then it's possible that that's still going to be a productive conversation.
Yeah, thank you. A question that Sandra dropped in here: does feeling safe include emotional and mental, or are we just talking about physical safety in this context? And I'm guessing that's in reference maybe to your conversation about the key to humility is psychological safety. how would
Yeah.
you sort of parse those out?
Yeah, right. So we start from a place of psychological security. And it's possible, yes, and I hear what you're saying. And again, I would never, nor would I ever want to intimate that you should pursue relationships with people where you are physically or emotionally or mentally unsafe. Right. I would never want to say that you should interact with people who are continually exploitive or abusive. Right. You have to have boundaries, and you have to make sure that you're maintaining enough self-respect and self-worth that you don't do that. On the other hand, it's possible that when we're discussing ideas with other people, especially those with whom we disagree, it might feel as if those ideas are dangerous or unsafe, whereas we might actually in actuality be safe even though we disagree with those ideas. So I think a bit of the work is for us to figure out what's our discomfort, and then where are the areas where we're genuinely and legitimately unsafe. And if you are legitimately unsafe, if you're feeling threatened, exploited, abused, get distance, get safe. Or is it just you're uncomfortable with the ideas? Then that's just a little bit more of distress tolerance and pushing into those tough conversations.
Thank you. Last question, and we'll let you kind of finish up here. And that I think it's just kind of a broader question, but the wondering is, why did you use ancient when you describe this word virtue?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why is because I think humility has been something that philosophers, theologians, thinkers, poets, writers have thought about for millennia. This is not a brand new idea. It's something that people have long said is something good. And so it's really just kind of hearkening back on some ancient wisdom that's been there a while, and realizing I think we need it now more in our current context than ever before.
Thank you. All right.
Yeah. All right.
We'll
So
let you get through these 10 minutes.
Great.
Sorry.
Yeah. All right. So the last thing I want to just talk about is how can we avoid some pitfalls? One of the things that we need to avoid is what I would call creeping moral amplification or sacralization. And so if we're really virtuous, especially when it comes to changing our minds, because this was about navigating difficult conversations, we should not just change, it doesn't imply we change our minds about everything. That we, and on certain moral topics, we might be pretty resolved, right? So if you were to tell me that if you were to tell me that you believe human trafficking is a good idea, I don't have to change my mind. I can say, like, there's nothing you can say that's ever going to change my mind. Human trafficking is bad, it's immoral, it's unjust. The problem, though, is when we give every issue in our mind that same type of special moral status, and we elevate it above rethinking or revision. Right. So I'm not going to change my mind thinking that human trafficking is bad. I know it's bad. I know it's unjust. But if I do that for everything, I think, and I'm like, no, you're never going to change my mind that pineapple on pepper on pizza is a worthy topping, or whatever kind of you want to fill in the blank. And so what that means is we become closed-minded, right? We're so resolute, we're so moral, we're closed-minded. I think there's probably only a handful of things that we should really never revise. But what we do is we kind of elevate everything to that moral status and say, I'm unwilling to change my mind. So one question for you, and you can just kind of answer this on your own, is what are your essential non-negotiables, right? And if you list everything, well, maybe you kind of need to revisit your list. A second pitfall is when we just rearrange our prejudices. So William James, one of the founders of modern day psychology, says a great many people think they are thinking when they're merely rearranging their prejudices. So some of this work comes out of my research on religion. So I study people who have left religion. And one of the things that I find is that people who have left religion, especially kind of really conservative fundamentalist upbringings, as soon as they leave religion, they kind of get fundamentalist about something else. And so a lot of them leave kind of this right-leaning fundamentalist evangelical upbringing, and they become really strong, extreme left-leaning political activists, and they're just as fundamentalist about that. And so have they really changed and become more open-minded and intellectually humble, or have they just rearranged their prejudices, right? So humility, and especially when it comes to navigating difficult conversations with intellectual humility, it's not just shifting the target of your vitriol. Okay, you're not intellectually humble if for half of your life you thought Democrats were the enemy, and now you're so enlightened you think Republicans are the enemy, or vice versa, right? That's not intellectual humility. You're just as entrenched and dogmatic. You just have a different target. right? So the question is, in what ways are you empathic toward an understanding of those with whom you disagree? Right? That's your question for whether or not you might just be rearranging your prejudices when you change your mind. The third pitfall is existential confrontations. So our worldviews, like I mentioned, provide us with meaning and permanence in an uncertain and chaotic world. And so a lot of times we are rewarded for holding these beliefs with conviction, and we're unwilling to change them because there's simply too much at stake. And so if you think about, for example, one of the existential realities is one day we're going to die. A worldview that addresses what happens to that is religion, right? If I'm wrong about religion, depending on your view of religion, that may have eternal consequences for me. So there's so much at stake. I don't want to change my mind because I'm not willing to risk it. And so how can we hold our deepest convictions humbly that allows room for revision while avoiding the defensiveness that comes from not wanting to risk all that is at stake? And so what I'm wondering is, do we need to build an existential distress tolerance for holding those beliefs humbly? So what that means is, do we need to be okay living with the anxiety and the doubt of realizing we might be wrong? Because chances are we probably are, right? It's only a couple hundred years ago they were putting people into house arrest for thinking that the earth wasn't the center of the universe. And now we're all like, clearly we know it's this. And in like a couple hundred years, we'll look like idiots because we don't know what we're talking about. So I think some examples of humility that we might have thought of historically, we think of Saul of Tarsus, right? So here's this person who is persecuting religious individuals, has this amazing experience, suddenly changes, religiously converts and becomes the Apostle Paul. Galileo and Copernicus, right? Like I mentioned, they created these heliocentric viewpoints. So they said the sun might be what things are rotating around. And they did that based on empirical data, even though it came at great costs to themselves. This one's kind of a fun one I like to bring in. The National Highway Safety Traffic Administration, I think, are quite humble. And some of you are like, what is he talking about? Well, how many of you learned how to drive with your hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel? Was that any of you? That was me, right? But then did you realize if you do that, the airbags, when it go off, will smack your hands into your head. So now they teach people to drive with your hands at 9 and 3. So when the airbag goes off, it blows your arms to the side. And so changing based on empirical evidence is just kind of another example of humility. So that's just a fun one I like to throw in there, that maybe we can be as humble as the Traffic Safety Administration, and we can change in accordance to how times are changing as well. So in summary, if you take something home from this today, I want you to remember humility is marked by our ability to know ourselves, check ourselves, and go beyond ourselves. So we know ourselves, we can acknowledge and own our limitations and the fallibility of our beliefs. We can check ourselves, we can restrain our ego, our need for superiority and defensiveness, especially when sharing our viewpoints with others. And we can go beyond ourselves. We can listen, we can cultivate curiosity, we can be teachable, and we can really seek to understand other people's viewpoints. So it's knowing ourselves, checking ourselves, and going beyond ourselves. If you're interested, you can pick up my book next Tuesday in the library. We'll have this second session, and we only have a couple minutes for me to open up the floor for shorter speeches disguised as questions. But thank you for your time tonight.
Yeah. Thank you, Daryl. And yeah, if you have any last questions, feel free. Or better option is to come next Tuesday and join us in person and ask Daryl your questions in person. Daryl, can you just share a little bit, like, what's going to be our purpose for next Tuesday? What's going to be different about next Tuesday than what we experienced tonight?
Yeah, absolutely. So next Tuesday, we're going to roll up our sleeves and we're actually going to put some of these things into practice. And so we're going to start the long, hard work, right? The first step of the marathon training of starting to cultivate humility. And so it's going to be much more interactive, which is why we're going to be doing it in person. It's going to be much more participatory, but introverts and extroverts alike are invited. I'm an introvert, so I'll make sure that introverts feel comfortable. But it's going to be much more participatory, and we're going to make sure that there's plenty to do, plenty of discussion and plenty of interaction to start cultivating humility.
Yeah. Thank you, Daryl. Yeah. So we really hope that you can join us next week, and also know that you can bring friends, family members, anyone else who would want to practice it, even if they didn't attend tonight or don't even watch this presentation before next week. They are welcome to come. It's not a prerequisite that they know all of this foundational stuff on humility to attend next week. We really invite everyone, and just like Dr. Van Tongeren has said, we just think that, part of our commitment as the Human Relations Commission is that in this time and in this space, the practice of humility really is something that we believe can be a powerful healing vessel for our communities as we think about all of the different things that are going on right now. So yes, please, as Esther said, please give Dr. Van Tongeren a loud applause, which means in this space, there's an applause thing with your hands, or you just go like this. And we are really thankful for him tonight and all of his expertise. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you next Tuesday night, 6:30 at Herrick District Library.